Now, I'd like to begin and introduce the topic to us, really, and by asking you to bear in mind some, what to some of you may consider to be introductory points, but I think they're often missed and they need serious reflection. The first is that Islam is a religion. It's not an ethnicity. Not all Arabs are Muslims. In fact, the majority of Muslims are not Arab. There are Christian Arabs, and there are indeed Jewish Arabs. And the most populous Muslim country in the world does not lie in the Middle East, but thousands of miles away in Indonesia, followed by Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, before the first Arab nation, Egypt, comes in at a distant fifth most populous Muslim state. Secondly, Judaism is not only a religion, it is a culture, a civilization in which religion is an important part. But it has always been a peoplehood. A man who converted to the Jewish religion became Avraham ben Avraham, Abraham son of Abraham, or for a woman, Sarah, daughter of Sarah. In other words, he or she inherited the history of a people which he now joined as part of his religious conversion. And thirdly, there are not only religious varieties, but there are a significant proportion of Jews who are secular, but who identify as Jews. And interestingly enough, I think we're seeing the signs of a similar development in Christianity. Note that whilst 59% of the population in the UK identify themselves as Christian, less than 10% go to church regularly, and possibly there are signs of a secularist Muslim movement which may appear marginal in Islam and is seen by the majority of Muslims as a Western innovation. Another important factor lies in the number of adherents. Approximately 2.2 billion Christians, 1.7 billion Muslims, and about 15 million Jews, or about 1% of the number of Muslims, or 0.75% in comparison with the number of Christians. So we have to take care in offering simple comparisons and equivalences which are not only erroneous, but can contribute to a common stereotype, an anti-Semitic stereotype in some cases, of a Jewish world conspiracy. Finally, it is essential to remember that neither Christianity, Judaism, or Islam are, or ever were, even in antiquity, a united force. One outstanding shared characteristic is that they have developed not despite, but because of unending and sometimes quite violent internal conflicts caused by diverging interpretations of the same cultural heritage. Citizenship is the primary way in which people belong to and are members of a particular society or community. Citizenship in the modern nation-state can be defined as membership in a political community that exists over a sovereign territory. The key word in this definition is territory, because the association of citizenship or belonging with a specific geographical territory is a recent development in history, although there are exceptions, some such as Amritsar for Sikhs or Israel for Jews, which affect identity. Traditionally, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, or Christians define themselves in terms of their shared laws, values, and beliefs. If and when they had to move, they would take their laws, values, and beliefs with them. It was not so much territory that defined their identity, but values and a way of life, a role often played by religion. However, the modern nation-state is defined by a distinct geographical territory. To live within this territory is to be within the jurisdiction of the nation-state, and thus to be a member of the community of people who equally live within its borders. It is difficult to be a citizen of more than one nation-state. At one point, it was impossible to carry more than one passport. Today, that's changed. Yet, in reality, it is quite common to have multiple identities, such as religious, cultural, ethnic, and social.
Often these identities cut across various geographical and linguistic boundaries, and so it was common to move freely between one territory and another, alternating between languages without significantly losing any sense of belonging to the same community. Our modern nation state is unique in history for its privileging of territorial identity and normally a single language. The modern nation state is also unique in defining itself as an association of separate individuals. In the past, one belonged to a tribe, a clan, a caste, an ethnic group, a religious community, and so on. And to possess rights solely as an individual, irrespective of another affiliation, is a modern invention. As such, people are treated equally by the state, and consequently, other forms of collective identity, such as ethnic, cultural, or religious, that associates the individual with anything other than the state can at times be viewed as problematic. And this is perhaps why the modern nation state can feel threatened by the demands made by cultural or religious groups for separate rights or recognition. Consider, for example, the demands made by the Basque and Catalan people in Spain. A common national identity does not contradict multiple sources of identity. It does not go against a shared, common, overarching identity to possess multiple identities, commonly called a hybrid or hyphenated identity. There is no reason why a person cannot be Quebecois and Canadian, or Scottish and British, or Muslim and French, or Catholic and English, or Welsh and Jewish. This is not to say that conflicts between these identities do not arise. They often do. But usually they emerge when one's identity is defined so tightly as to exclude others. And that's, Michael, you asked about the question of Prince Charles and the coronation. And that's why there's the conversation about defender of faith rather than defender of the faith. The concept of a hybrid identity is relatively new to Europe, but it has a longer history and is much more common in the United States. A joke is told about a Jew from Warsaw who in the year 1900 travelled to New York. And he came back and he told his friends what he'd seen. He said, it was amazing, he said. I met a Jew who was a communist, and I met a Jew who was a capitalist. I met a Jew who was Reform, I met a Jew who was Orthodox, I met a Jew who was ultra-Orthodox. I met a Jew who was rich, I met a Jew who was poor. I met a Jew who was secular. And his friends said, what's so strange? There are lots of Jews in New York. He said, you don't understand. It was the same Jew. Now, a consequence of hybrid identities is that people regularly cross boundaries that divide insider from outsider, thus blurring identity boundaries that were previously more clearly defined. Boundaries are often remade, redefined, reimagined, thus creating new identities, even new cultures and new relations. And in the process of such changes, collective identities of groups change and their collective memories are reinterpreted. So can an old identity be redefined? In times of change, when people have to adjust and to redefine who they are, identities can be quite fragile. The reaction against rapidly shifting boundaries of identity, especially when one or more identity is perceived to be under threat, inevitably leads to an over-rootedness in one's identity and a subsequent decrease in a desire to integrate in society and to engage in a dialogue with others. And this is an increasing feature in many countries today as we're here. Our common overarching identity needs to allow sufficient space for other identities, all of which need to be open and inclusive enough to allow for harmonious coexistence with other groups. When one identity is not open enough and excludes the other, then it is a threat to established harmony. An example is when some neo-fascist Greeks insist that to be Greek one has to be white and Orthodox Christian. Or another example could be when religious extremists, Jews, Christian or Muslim, identify themselves as believers and the rest of their country as infidels. Both are examples of a serious threat to the established order of coexistence.
Unlike national identities, religious identities are sacred to those who hold them, and their key events have usually occurred much further in the past than most national events. For example, Muslims find contemporary meaning in the Hijra, the emigration from Mecca to Medina of Muhammad and his followers in 622. Likewise, Jews view the exodus from Egypt as of contemporary significance, as Christians view the death and resurrection of Christ. For Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the inheritance of the past is important to their religious identity and their encounter, but so too is the continuing relevance of this past. Learning from the past does not require us to live there, but there are some believers who would wish to restore the past by force if necessary. And to what extent we should remember or forget the past clearly has an impact on memory and identity. Commemorations of past events relate the collective memory of an historical community to an inaugural moment or a founding act, and by repetition, they help preserve a sense of historical continuity, identity, and even social integration. Collective memory contains a strong conservative force, furnishing a community with a sense of historical continuity, and by reenacting these founding moments, the inspiration of the heroic or the founding event is preserved and reinforced. However, a preoccupation, some might call an obsession with the past, may be harmful. The memory of a founding event that is recollected and reenacted may become a danger, especially if it becomes the only or the primary lens through which reality and the changing world is viewed. For example, the legacy of being a victim has left an enduring mark on the Jewish psyche and impacts on the Jewish encounter with Christians and Muslims. A history of being surrounded by oppressive nations has become a feature of Jewish memory and identity, leading to this sense of victimization. An example is what's called the 614th commandment proposed by Emil Fackenheim in his reflection on the Holocaust, which demanded Jewish continuity so as not to give Hitler a posthumous victory. Consequently, Jewish identity easily became Holocaust or Shoah-centered, as can relations between Jews and non-Jews. The Holocaust reinforced a mentality in the Jewish world that Jews are a small minority and that the Jewish people, even Jews in Israel, are surrounded by hostile non-Jews. Like Jews, Muslims also tend to view the outside world as a threat, which may lead to a preoccupation with the memory of suffering. Studies of the views of Muslims in Islamic countries in the 21st century list numerous examples of Muslims feeling under attack by the West, which are viewed as a Judeo-Christian creation. Akbar Ahmed, for example, in Washington, asked Muslims across the Muslim world, "What do you think the number one problem is in the world today?" He expected the answer to be Israel or Palestine, Iraq or Afghanistan. However, to Muslims in Damascus, in Karachi, and in London, the number one problem was the perception that Islam was deliberately being distorted in the West, that Islam was under attack. Consequently, a negative identity is easily formed and relations are viewed as being based on a victim-perpetrator relationship. In their contemporary encounter, Jews, Christians, and Muslims have much to discuss. Theologically, it is argued that Islam is similar to Judaism, more so than Christianity, since both have problems with Christian Trinitarian theology. Both stress religious law and the centrality of monotheism, and neither have a priesthood. The 2008 Muslim letter to the Jewish community, Call to Dialogue, is an example of a contemporary attempt to demonstrate the commonality between these two faiths. However, the rise of modern political Zionism, the creation of the State of Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, have become major sources of tensions between Jews and Muslims, not just in the Middle East, but beyond. There are also important bridges between Islam and Christianity, since both have a strong sense of mission to people of other religions, and Jesus is revered by Muslims as a prophet. The 2007 letter from Muslim scholars to the Christian world, A Common Word, outlines the similarities between the two faiths. But tensions and violence also exists, as demonstrated by the violence between Muslims and Christians in, for example, Africa, such as the Nigeria Sharia riots. The three faiths, particularly Islam, have difficulty with their radicals or fundamentalists, and the Wahhabi sect, which has a following amongst many Muslims, including amongst diaspora communities in the West, seeks to return to an idealized form of certain early Islamic values and strongly condemns many other forms of Islam as well as other religions. Christian and Jewish fundamentalism also exists and is growing, alongside similar movements in Hinduism and other world religions. Jewish fundamentalists generally focus on issues related to the land and state of Israel and take many hardline political positions. In recent years, they have emerged as a significant political and religious force within Israel. Haredi, that is, very strictly orthodox fundamentalists, not only affirm the literal truth of the Bible, but seek to impose many biblical and Talmudic laws and ordinances upon the state of Israel. Some, both within and outside Israel, have joined with Christian fundamentalists in calling for the building of a third temple in Jerusalem. While largely secluded from mainstream society, following a tightly regulated lifestyle, ultra-Orthodox beliefs and the moral understanding of the world have similarities to those of some evangelical Christian communities. Christian allies of Jewish fundamentalists, who are part of the Christian Zionist movement, believe that the creation of the Jewish state in 1948 and the yet-to-be-built Third Temple are theological prerequisites for the second coming of Christ. Some of these same fundamentalists also actively seek the conversion of Jews to Christianity, a complicated picture. Often, religious extremists have a special loathing of co-religionists whose views do not fit their own. For example, the Al-Qaeda movements have been quite as prepared to kill other Muslims as they have Jews and Christians, Americans and British, and other perceived enemies. Israel-Palestine stands out as a prominent issue, brimming with emotion and passion. It is rare to find organizations, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, which are explicitly pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. Normally you find one who's pro one and anti the other. And in my experience, blinkered views prevail. For Jews, the reasons are fairly obvious. The centrality of the land of the Bible, as well as the survival of over a third of world Jewry, is at stake. Christians, for their part, not only disagree as to the place of Israel in Christian theology, but feel particular concern for Christians who live in the Holy Land, as well as for Palestinians in general. While Jews may view the creation of the State of Israel as an act of national liberation, following nearly 2,000 years of powerlessness and homelessness, many Muslims view the same events as the Nakba, the disaster, a time when Islamic society was uprooted and became a minority in a land that was once Dar al-Islam. Most Jews do not separate Zionism from its deep religious roots within Judaism. However, many Christians and Muslims, well, this is when you should have checked the order of your pages. I have to say, number 9 has disappeared. What I wanted to say, and I'm going to have to ad-lib, so forgive me. That in the very use of the language that we apply to that piece of land about the size of Wales, whether we use the term Holy Land, Promised Land, Judah, Samaria, Israel, Palestine, the Zionist entity, each of these terms carry particular baggage. And we have to be so careful with the terms that we use when we engage in a conversation about them. So the language of conflict and the language of conversation are absolutely vital when we deal with the issue of politics and religion. I would add that there are numerous examples of mutual antipathy and prejudice on all sides. The conflict is felt thousands of miles away from the Middle East, reinforced by the disproportionate attention given inside and beyond the communities. Muslim sympathy with the Palestinians is sometimes seen by Jews as threatening to the Jewish community and feeding rising anti-Semitism in the UK and Europe. Likewise, many Muslims and Christians see Jews as homogeneous in their support and defense of Israel, unwilling to accept any criticism of the Jewish state. One of the exercises I set my students on a course on Muslim-Jewish relations is for the Muslim students to read the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish students to read Muslim Week. And surprise, surprise, they realize that the concerns are basically the same. And the stereotypes are very, very similar. And that, it seems to me, is ironic and contributes to the fact that both Muslims and Jews in this case feel vulnerable, misunderstood, and under attack. So I hope these brief reflections have shown the need to appreciate the significance of religious identity in the 21st century and its implications for understanding international affairs. In particular, I hope we will consider how politicians and diplomats need to show an understanding of and a sensitivity to the tensions between and within religious communities, to improve communication skills with majority and minority faith communities as well as secular groups, and finally, to be better equipped to negotiate the role of religion in everyday life, including the sensitivity of conflict language. Thank you.